When Lou Gerstner took over as head of IBM, he actually rescued IBM from a looming disaster. He was bombarded, this was about 12 years ago, I suppose, before PowerPoint came along, amazingly enough. He was bombarded with a series of presentations by the top executives what he should do with their bit of his new company. He'd come from American Express, and each executive would spend 2 days on the presentation, and it would be foils, overhead projector stuff. And after a month of this, Lou Gerstner sent out an edict all over IBM, no more foils. They were a substitute for thinking, he thought, like that yellow highlighter pen that people use when they're reading documents. You think you've taken it in, and all you've done is highlighted. So we haven't even got foils here. Other sobering moment occurred on the first trip. I dropped in to see a man called Joe Kraus in Silicon Valley, Palo Alto, beautiful rural Palo Alto, now full of high tech, of course. Joe Kraus, when I first met him 10 years before, less than 10 years before, had just become one of 5 of his friends who were each worth about £13 million at the age of 26. They'd had an initial public offering, a share flotation of their business called Excite, a search engine called Excite. And as the 1990s went on, this would be 1995 or 6, as the 1990s went on, this search engine grew and grew to an iconic building on the interstate by the bay in Silicon Valley, 2,000 employees, and eventually merged with another company called At Home to form Excite at Home, and by 1999 it was worth $6.7 billion on the stock market, and the next year it was dead. And so Joe Kraus is a very interesting man to ask about bubbles and things like that. He got out with quite a lot of his money intact, and was by then running another company when I saw him, called JotSpot, a wiki writing company, which he's now sold to Google, but that's another story. Now, Joe Kraus has had time to think very hard about what went wrong and why 2 people coming out of Stanford, just as these 6 people had come out of Stanford, but slightly later, had formed something called Google, which is now the biggest media company in the world, while Excite at Home, doing exactly the same thing, at least theoretically, was dead. Well, they got the business plan a bit wrong, he said at Excite. They were too 20th century. They went for the top 100 American advertisers, where Google went for the top 300,000 advertisers. This amazing way they use their algorithms to put the ads very specifically up, ignoring the banner ads, which were so important to the 20th century way of looking at an internet business proposition. And then, of course, there's the long tail, this now famous idea that an internet company can make most of its money from the things that a bricks and mortar business can't really look at. Barnes & Noble has 120,000 books in its shops. Amazon.com makes, if it makes money at all, makes some money from, 40% of its money from the 120,000 books that Barnes & Noble would stock, but it makes 60% of its money from the 2 million other books that it has access to in its various storage ways that Barnes & Noble can only order. And Amazon can get them to you very quickly indeed. It's the long tail. It's the internet is making the long tail such an interesting business proposition because the network makes it available. And Joe Kraus then summed up. He said the 20th century was about dozens of markets of millions of people, mass production era. The 21st century is about millions of markets of dozens. And when we put it out in the program 2 years ago, I thought that was one of the most profound things we'd ever broadcast. And it's the thing that's changing the world now. And I'll explain a bit later how it runs into the heartbeat economy. I went round the Googleplex in March. It's rather a larger building than it was the first time I went round, but there are similarities. The wonderful thing about the Googleplex, where Google is run from near the Bay in Silicon Valley, is the reception. There's a grand piano, and there are lots of lava lamps, and the bicycles everywhere, just like 60s California. But there, above the reception desk in the buildings, is a sensor. They take the sex out, which will be considerable, and limited, because otherwise it will flash up too fast, a selection of the searches going on live at any one time. And the man who was taking me around, we boxed and coxed for the microphone, and I read one out and he read the other out. And then I stopped after a minute and a half and said, hey, nobody's ever been able to do this before. We're looking at the mind of the world. And Google seems to me to be, well, it's flexing its muscles, or beginning to now, but incredibly underestimated. It is a most powerful, powerful thing. It's like the unchaining of the books in the medieval library, or the Mass in Latin. It's one of those democratic things that is really very profound, until somebody comes along and does Google better, of course, and then Google's eminence or preeminence vanishes, which is why they're digging in all over the place at the moment. Joe Pine said another memorable thing in one of our programs years ago now. People don't want a choice, he said. Consumers don't want a choice. They want exactly what they want. And that's difficult to do if you've got a mass production sort of mentality. Dell production, the order pulls the machine along the production line. It's difficult in the Dell business model to see where service ends, production begins, manufacturing, and then service takes over for the delivery of the thing itself. And Dell is now, of course, struggling too, so maybe even that preeminence doesn't last very long. When my daughter ordered an Apple computer, not Dell at all, she tracked it coming from Hong Kong or China or wherever it's made, and then when it arrived, she opened the box and pressed the on button. Well, I don't know what happens if you do that with Dell, but if you do that with an Apple, it comes on. Amazing trick of consumer satisfaction. Absolutely glorious. Then she noticed the little wireless thing was winking, so she, within a minute and a half of opening the box for the very first time for her Apple computer, laptop, she was on the internet. Absolutely extraordinary experience, and that's the kind of thing I'm edging towards. That will save, or help to save, manufacturing. Of course, that was a Chinese manufactured thing, but the experience was an extremely important one. An example of the currents that are now getting so interesting is the way the French wine trade has been battered down by the rise of New World wines, with two simple instruments which are about information. The New World wines came along, and they were varietal wines, wines made of a single grape, and they put that on the front label. French wine regulations did not allow the French winemaker to put what wine was in the bottle on the label, the grape. So you didn't know that a claret was a mix of so-and-so and so-and-so. They weren't allowed to tell you because of the haughtiness of 150 years of appellation contrôlée. And then the other thing that the French weren't allowed to do by their regulators, and the New World wines leaped on and then leaped into the shelves of the supermarkets, particularly in Britain, was the back label. So you could educate yourself. The newly wealthy or the newly wine-drinking classes could educate themselves as they drank the wine. Sauvignon Blanc, hey, liked that, and then they went round and bought another one. This amazing sort of educational process going on has battered the French to their knees, overproducers of average wine compared with the wines people like to buy coming from, well, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. An extraordinary change, and that is about information, and that is about informed consumers. That is the kind of service, implicit service, that a 21st century consumer will want. That's the way to fight back against the mass production world.